Welcome to Zoom. Enter your meeting ID followed by pound. Enter your participant ID followed by pound. Otherwise, just press pound to continue. You are in the meeting now. There are 17 participants in the meeting. This meeting is being recorded.
actually a higher tax than ACES was until 110. It requires all data, including sales price and costs that may be proprietary in nature, to be made available to the public. So anything, any contractor, any employee, all of that becomes publicly available data. It switches to a monthly severance tax or from an annual to a monthly severance tax. And while that you don't care about that, you think, oh, who cares? The companies have lots of accountants and auditors, and they can easily do this monthly tax calculation. But if you're a company like ConocoPhillips that has ownership in the Colville River unit and in Kuparic and in Prudhoe Bay and in other areas, they could easily see filing 72 tax filings a year, which means the Department of Revenue would have to audit all of those as well. So that's what it does. So how does it impact industry? So as I said, our analysis shows, and the proponents even say, that this would generate about $1 billion to $1.5 billion from these 3 units. At current prices, you can see this chart shows that it doesn't, the line shows what we pay in addition to what we already pay. So this is the increase on top of our current production tax. And at current prices, you can see because we go to a flat 35% rate and it doesn't adjust for price, that at the price range that we're in, this is about a 350% more than what we currently pay in production tax. I already mentioned it's a higher tax than ACES until about 110, but it's an extreme tax increase.
Kara, I've been told that that hand up there means there's a question online.
I think it means they've raised their hand.
Oh.
They're muted.
Sorry, Kara, this is Scott Jepson. I wasn't able to hear the audio, but the host there got it fixed.
Oh, okay, awesome. Okay. Yay, Jomo. Okay.
Sorry, everybody.
All right, we're now, I think this is slide 7, says 7. Okay. So it is clear that the initiative targets the core fields, or the legacy fields, sometimes as they're referred to. I already mentioned what they are. And some believe that there isn't any more investment happening in these core fields, so there's this philosophy that we might as well get what we can because they're not going to do any more, and there's nothing that we can do to stem the decline in these aging fields. And the fact of the matter is that's not true. If you look at the red boxes on this chart, they identify projects that are in the existing core fields that have not been sanctioned for development yet, but are certainly in the planning stages and in the process of being sanctioned. So you've got in the Alpine field or the Colville River unit, you have Narwhal, Fjord West, and the Kuparic River unit. You have the Nuna field. Nuna was actually a field put together by Kalis. It's basically a shovel-ready project that when Kalis left the state of Alaska, ConocoPhillips purchased that, and now Nuna is part of the Kuparic River unit. So this is a new field that would be immediately subject to this initiative because it's in an existing core unit. Then you've got Eastern News, and then you have IPAD, MPAD, and another project within Prudhoe Bay. If you take all of those together, very near-term development drilling within the existing oil fields, it will take about $11 billion in capital over the next decade, and if all of those projects came online, it would easily generate about 150,000 barrels a day of new production. So it won't all come online at the same time, but if you think about any other private sector industry in the state of Alaska who has the opportunity or plans and the ability to invest about $11 billion over the next decade. We have a hard time finding another one, and so this actually initiative targets these core fields and definitely puts these investments at risk. So we also hear that Senate Bill 21 hasn't done a thing for the state of Alaska, and that couldn't be further from the truth as well. We know that since Senate Bill 21 passed, the state has seen more production and more revenue than was forecasted in 2013. So what this slide shows in the red is actual production until you get to 2019, and then it's the forecast. The gray line shows you the last revenue forecast under ACES in 2013. So if you just look from 2007 to 2013, in a period of record high oil price, the state of Alaska lost over 200,000 barrels a day of production. And then when you pass Senate Bill 21, unfortunately, we had some severe low oil prices in 2015 and 2016, but the investments that were made had stabilized our production to hover around 500,000 barrels a day. So just let me give you an example. In 2013, the last revenue sources book before Senate Bill 21 passed, the average price was $118 a barrel, and the forecast for this fiscal year that ended in 2019 in June, the forecast showed that our production would be 422,000 barrels a day. Fast forward, the average oil price is about $50 to $60 less, and you can see we actually ended with 80,000 barrels a day more than what was forecasted. If you also take that same data and estimate the same level of spend, the same oil price, don't make any adjustments, in the same period of Senate Bill 21 from 2013 to 2019, the state has actually generated $1.5 billion more than they would have under ACES. And I have a couple examples of that later in the presentation. But I think it's also important, if you look out to the forecast for the next 2 years, ACES was predicting that in 2 years our production would be at 350,000 barrels a day. The revenue sources book that came out 2 weeks ago has adjusted that to over 450,000 barrels a day. So for those that say Senate Bill 21 has done nothing for the state of Alaska, I just couldn't disagree more. So yes, last week you saw this revenue slide from the Vote Yes folks about taxes paid to the state, showing that the industry has negative tax and that we no longer pay tax in Alaska. Well, that is incredibly flawed and inaccurate, and let me show you why. So, total government take under Senate Bill 21. So this is the Vote Yes data with the full picture. So first of all, they tried to suggest production taxes net of credits incurred. So yes, the state of Alaska had a program that offered cashable credits to companies, but there is no obligation by the state to pay those credits, as some companies painfully found out. In fact, it's a line item subject to appropriation, no different than school funding, no different than DOT funding, no different than healthcare funding. So to suggest that credits should be deducted from production tax is incredibly disingenuous. It also suggests that the companies who pay production tax, which I would suggest when you look at actual production tax, over 80% of the production tax comes from those three fields with 80-some% of the production. Those three fields never qualified for cash credits. So the Vote Yes folks are deducting credits from the majority of production from fields that never qualified for the credits. The other thing that the slide from last week did not show, it only showed property taxes paid to the state. Again, that is not a complete picture of revenue. So here is so first of all, here was the line of actual production taxes. You can see that over ACES from 2014 to 2019, our production taxes paid to the state is $770 million. It has never been negative. State property tax, so that is one line we can agree with. That's $120 million roughly, but it excluded property taxes paid to the municipality. As Fairbanks knows well hand, you receive a portion of the property tax that we pay for any infrastructure going through the North Slope Borough or the North Star Borough, which is, obviously the pipeline. And we pay one check to the state of Alaska. It's the state who then divvies it out to the municipalities. So in our view, we absolutely need to include local property tax in addition to state property tax when you talk about total revenue to the state. Then you have income tax. This is another line that I will not challenge of the vote yes folks. But I will say, why did we have a negative number in fiscal year 16 and 17? Why would you have a negative corporate income tax as a business owner? You lost money. And that's exactly what happened. We had low oil price, we lost money in fiscal year 16, and we lost money in fiscal year 17. So if you take that subtotal of taxes, you can see the actual average is $1.4 billion in total tax revenue. The vote yes folks also do not include royalty. Royalty is a cost, no different than Carl paying royalty on any mining claims that he has worked on over the years. So we pay royalty to the state as the landowner. It is a cost of doing business. We also have other revenue, whether it be CBR settlements or things of that nature. So all told, when you look at total government take, total revenue to the state of Alaska during Senate Bill 21, the average has been almost $3.2 billion. So then this just also summarizes when we talk about revenue that the industry pays. This is our projected revenues for FY 2020. This is state and local, so all of those categories that we talked about. We're estimated to pay this current fiscal year $2.6 billion in revenue. And according to presentations that the mining companies made to House Resources and commercial fishing, you can see how we compare to other industries. So we may no longer be 80% of the state's budget because of declining price and rising state budgets, but we are certainly absolutely the largest contributor to state revenue. So it is not accurate to say that we've never paid negative tax. We have always contributed to the state of Alaska, and it's just one of the most egregious things I think I hear during this argument. This is another slide that was shared last week, and this chart implies that Senate Bill 21 single-handedly gutted the coffers of the Alaska Treasury. Well, the reality is, again, that's not the full story. So these are very convenient numbers, and there's some very convenient items that are left off. Namely, the significant factor from 2009 and 2010, even though oil price may have averaged the same, is look at the cost of business. We are spending more money in 2015. So our lease expenditures in 2010 was $4.7 billion. In 2015, it was 7.4. We were incentivized to spend money to increase production. So our lease expenditures were up 66%, but prices did fall, And remember, in 2015, we had negative corporate income tax. So we were losing money in 2015, and according to their analysis, we paid $2 per barrel. And again, this is on gross and only the production tax. This is not characteristic of all of our revenue. But for comparison's sake, we ran the comparison the same. So we looked at what would have happened under ACES in 2015. In 2015, because ACES did not have a minimum floor of the 4% gross that Senate Bill 21 has, that protects the state on the low side, the state barely would have received any production tax revenue in 15. They would have received zero in 2016. Again, 2017 was a very minimal amount, and 2018 and 2019, you can see that ACES would have generated a little bit more, but still not to the level that Vote Yes is suggesting that we could get back to. So what about credits? There's lots to talk about credits. And when I talk to lots of audiences, they have a lot of confusion, about credits. But I think the first clarification that I want to make is that the state of Alaska no longer offers cashable credits. And some of the credits that are part of or were part of the liability were actually generated under ACES. And the Senate Bill 21 changed a lot of the cashable credit structure. As I stated, the units that are being targeted by this ballot measure were never eligible for cash credits because it was only companies that had 50,000 barrels a day or less. The program ended, and as we talked about, it's truly at the discretion of the legislature. But what I really want to focus on is on the per barrel credit, because people talk about that like that's a cash payment, and it's not a cash payment. It's actually a deduction, and as you can see, without it, the state would have a flat 35% production tax rate. And we're not the only ones that say it's not a credit. So when Roger Marks was the legislative consultant, the retired state economist back in 2017, he gave a presentation to a joint House and Senate Resources Committee that talked about the per barrel credit is an adjustment to offset tax rates at low oil prices. Another legislative consultant said it's not really tax, it's really to try to set tax setting goals. But I think the best quote is here by the former tax division director who was the Vote Yes treasurer that says the per barrel credit is an offset. It is designed to create progressivity with a little bit lower tax at lower price and higher tax at higher price. It's really hard to consider them a credit. They're really an integral part of the tax system. So it's interesting to me that now the proponents of the tax of Vote Yes want to dismantle this tax system that was designed to have lower taxes at lower prices and higher taxes at higher prices. And for what? Some short-term revenue gains, but at what expense? Without the per barrel credit, as I said, we have a flat 35% of all prices. And this chart just demonstrates what former Director Alper was saying, is that as prices go down, our effective tax rate goes down. As prices go up, our effective tax rate goes up. And without the per barrel credit, this is, again, retired economist Roger Marks' analysis, we would not be within the competitive boundary anymore. So what Roger had done for the legislature is he looked at places like Texas, North Dakota, Norway, the UK, places where our companies compete for capital. And the competitive boundary for overall government take is this yellow line. Here's Alaska with the per barrel credit. So you can see at current prices from 55 to 75, we are right in that competitive range. And I think the investment that we've seen in Alaska proves that to be true. if you take away the per barrel credit, and remember the initiative does that and more, you can see that our overall government take would go up to 75% at current price. And I don't know if there's an analysis done yet of this competitive boundary, but if it were, my assumption is that this line would be even higher under the initiative because the initiative does more than just eliminate the per barrel credit. I just have a few more slides and talking about, you know, what Fairbanksons really care about, I think, and that is jobs. And you saw some jobs data from the Vote Yes folks last week, but in our view, it's another incomplete view of the data. So if you look at the data, so this is the exact same trend line, so you can see that in this black line, this is oil industry employment from the Department of Revenue. We've actually not cherry-picked dates. We actually included 2019 to show that there is an uptick in jobs and that the Department of Labor has said as Alaska comes out of the recession that we're in, the oil and gas industry is one of the few bright spots in 2019 because we had a net gain in jobs. And in 2020, Neil Freed told RDC last month that we're expected to see another small gain. But what the orange line is daily oil price averaged over that same time frame. So you can see the trend line is exactly the same. So to suggest that Senate Bill 21 is the absolute cause for job loss in Alaska is false. Oil jobs, unfortunately, had to be reduced because oil prices were reduced. And remember these 2 years when we were losing money? Look at why we were losing money in 15 and 16. We had dipped down to almost $26 a barrel. And the Alaska trend is no different than the national oil and gas jobs trend. So this is data. So the blue line is the same Alaska oil price, so that's A&S. And the orange line is from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, and this is in thousands of jobs, hundreds of thousands of jobs, I mean. So in 2013, there were 193,000 jobs across the industry in the U.S. It cratered in 2017, and it's on the same trajectory as Alaska oil jobs. So jobs in Alaska are no different than what you see trending in the lower 48. So I'm going to take a drink of tea, and I'm actually going to let Richard and Jen talk about some local job examples. This is a picture I took in the Flowline shop several years ago, what they experienced during ACES versus Senate Bill 21, and then I'll give an example from airport equipment rental that John gave me yesterday.
I'll go. Forgive me if I get nervous. I'm not used to presenting or talking about our business. It just feels awkward, but this is an important issue because it affects us, and I can prove it with our numbers at Flowline. And I'm going to take it back to ACES because that's sort of similar to what this ballot measure does. We would see the same increase in taxes on our clients. So ACES passed in November of 2007. By the end of 2009, 2 years later, we had lost 14 full-time equivalent employees. And these full-time equivalent employees are our union guys. I'm not talking about our support staff. It's our pure union numbers. 3 years later, in 2012, we were down an additional 37 full-time equivalent employees. So that's a total of 51 full-time equivalent, high-paying union jobs that we had lost. And we concluded that this was a direct representation of increase in taxes on the North Slope. They stopped spending money. Therefore, us as contractors, we weren't getting any work. And I'd like to add on to that, this was all during the time that oil prices were increasing. So our peer groups in the lower 48 were running double shifts, and we had basically some maintenance work. What else would I like to add?
Basically,
Richard, our president of Flowline, excuse me.
Basically, I was here when ACES passed. 2007, we had a bit of work. Price of oil, I want to say in 07 was, beginning of 07 was somewhere around $55, $60 a barrel. By the time '08 rolls around, towards the end of '08, it had a little dip. It gets back down to about $40, $45 a barrel. Then it slowly climbs back up to, I want to say, 100, 120, 111, 110 by the time you get to 2011, 2012. We had a certain amount of employees. We're a union contractor. Currently, I've got about 90 folks employed right now over at the shop. Back then, we had, I don't recall the numbers, what it was.
Which one?
07. But anyway, from 07 to about 12, yeah, we lost about 30 or 40 full-time equivalent work with high-paying folks. These aren't service industry. It's not, you know, these guys aren't getting paid $15 an hour. These guys are getting paid $35, $40 an hour, plus benefits, plus, I mean, these are real jobs. These are real jobs. People pay mortgages, people buy homes, people buying snow machines. Anyway, yearly I go to a conference of my peers down in the lower 48 every April or so. We get together, we talk, have a few beers, we play some golf, but what's everybody doing? What's new in the industry? What's going on? Just like anybody else. You have a mining conference, you have a forestry conference, you have a government conference, whatever. You get together, see what everybody's doing. Over the years, 8, 9, 10, 11, these guys, I'm busy, I'm getting busier, I'm getting busier. I'm hearing that from all of my people, all of my peer group down the lower 48. Busy. By the time 2011, 2012, some of these guys are running double, triple shifts in their facilities. And I'm thinking, man, what's going on with us? The only thing that you can tie this back to is ACEs, taxes go up, investment drops, less construction work, which then translates to less projects for us. Less projects means less employment. Anyway, yeah, we're down 35, 40 people from 07, 06, 05 time frame, and the price of oil is at $110, $120 a barrel. I remember when I was a kid, my dad used to go, man, oil would just be able to get to $25, $30 a barrel. How many of you guys remember that from back in the 80s? We'll be sitting in tall cotton. The legislature they were spending money like drunken sailors down there, to be quite honest. I mean, they're raking in the dollars. They're getting all sorts of money. But construction jobs, new projects, not for us. So 2014 rolls around, SB 21 comes around, price of oil 50, I mean, heck, it dropped down to what, $40, $30 a barrel back in 15. I'm busier now at $70 or $65 a barrel of oil than I was at 120. I can sit here and say, I see work for the first time, I can say in 25 to 30 years, that I see work coming up with the oil industry over the next 10 years. I can see projects, I'm quoting projects out 5, 10 years out now for budgetary numbers for their engineering purposes. I could never do that. When the price of oil was at $110 a barrel, I figured people would be beating down the doors. Nope. But here we are. I mean, SB 21 did a lot. I mean, we go change this thing, and I'm deathly afraid that we're going to be back to 07, 08 time frame, 10, 11. I'm laying guys off, and they're not knowing what to do. It's a scary time, to be quite honest, looking at this tax proposal.
I think John Cook from Airport Equipment Rental gave me a pretty similar example, and I'm just going to read what he sent me because he couldn't be here this morning. He said when ACES passed, it took about a year for the oil companies to turn off the spigot. That was John's term. Their company, North Slope revenues declined by 70%, and they cut their North Slope workforce in half. You know, fortunately, AES is a diversified, you know, company in several that ability had their flow in 2014. I hired them as a contractor in 2018, leather contractors that to $50 oil, and now they had in 2019 double revenues from those low 2016, 2018 years, and they're forecasted to be double again in 2020. So that is another local business that definitely saw a direct local jobs example between the two tax structures. So I'm just going to end with a couple slides here. One, this slide sometimes gets used in a mocking way against us about where we talk about the North Slope Renaissance. And so we already talked about those core fields. And my guess, Richard probably doesn't want to say, but my guess is some of those projects 5 to 10 years out are both in the core fields as well as the new fields outside of those core units. And there is a suggestion that the new fields will be held harmless and never have to pay this new tax, and that it's really only these companies here, and that the companies and these units don't need that revenue for any exploration or expansion out into the west in these new opportunities, and it also ignores the oil search play. So if you look at the core fields, the 11 billion over the next decade that could come online, in addition to their ongoing operating costs. If you look at Hillcorp over at the Liberty development, that's about a 50 to 60,000 per day field. This teal is Eni and Shell have some joint projects here. They're just north of the Kaparic River unit. They have oil search, as I mentioned. This is a pretty significant play of 100 to 120,000 barrels a day is what they have said. But they believe they have over 2 billion barrels of oil cumulative that they can produce. So once they reach that 400 million barrel mark, they too will be under this new tax structure. So this new tax does change the economics of their project. As it does some of the new fields like Willow. That's what BTU is the Willow unit right here. That is another large opportunity. So all told, if you look at the core fields and what is on the short-term horizon and new fields, that's about $24 billion in capital and hundreds of thousands of opportunity for production. So I'll just end with, I think when you look and talk to, Richard and Jen, obviously, about local jobs, if you talk to our other co-chairs, they just have a very strong belief and sense that this ballot measure goes too far. It will have a negative impact on our overall economy, and that ballot measures are the wrong tool for complex tax policy such as this. So with that, we've been talking for almost 50 minutes, and so happy to answer any questions that folks might have.
Kara, 50 minutes of talk is not as short for you.
I know.
Yeah.
Thank you for pointing that out.
Not a problem.
My husband says the same thing.
Yeah.
Gary says the same.
Kara, not a question, but a comment. Refining in this are a little bit different, but it's sort of the same principle with taxes. The refinery had to deal with state policy and legislation that penalized us on royalty oil. It penalized us because the legislature and the state fought against us and Petrostar on quality bank. The state went back years and years on tariff retroactivity after products have been refined and sold. So if anybody thinks a company won't walk away when policy is negative, I invite you to go out to North Pole and look at that flat field. And I invite you to see where all your gasoline comes from, and I guarantee you the security of supply of gasoline and the price is not what it would be if the legislature and the state, 3 governors, 3 commissioners, had listened to Flint Hills and Koch Industries, and nobody in this community, nobody in the legislature, nobody in the state government did a damn thing. We lost 188 very high-paying jobs, averaging around 100,000 with pay and benefits. And if you think a company won't walk away, they're going to look at comparative advantage and where they can do best. Go out and look at the tax base that we lost in this borough, and look at what happened to North Pole. So, amen.
I wasn't gonna say anything about your socks until you said nobody in this community did anything. Those are nice socks.
Thank you.
Okay, questions? Mike?
The companies look at this, all taxes and everything else, as just another cost, and they have to, as Jeff points out, operate on the margin. And I don't think that there's enough understanding of how marginal cost of development on existing fields works. That's one thing that needs to be pointed out. And then the other is that the places that we're competing, there's the report that I looked at was from the Fraser Institute, and the state is 11th out of 15 U.S. jurisdictions as far as competitiveness. And that there's a whole bunch more than taxes in there, but we look at that. Because one of the things they did point out was that the tax policy is an incentive. In essence, we're giving our oil away as other expenses in order to stay competitive. I shouldn't say giving away. We're reducing the price of our oil because of other expenses that we need to look at to get a win-win for everybody.
I think, Mike, to that point, if you look at what the average cost to produce a barrel of oil in Alaska, according to the Revenue Sources book, it's about $23 to $24 a barrel. We also have $9 plus transportation costs. So those two costs alone are much higher than some of our counterparts, certainly in the lower 48. I know in the ConocoPhillips annual report, I think it was in 2018, Scott can correct me if I'm wrong, but they said the lifting costs in Eagle Ford, which is in South Texas, was about $2 a barrel of oil equivalent, and transportation was about $2. So it's very convenient to try to just cherry pick and look at only one factor when, you know, the current legislative consultant, you know, Rich Rosario, gave a presentation to the legislature about a year and a half ago, I guess it'll be 2 years ago now in January, where he said, you know, you can't just look at the tax rate, you can't just look at government take, you have to look at internal rate of return, there's all these different factors, and you can't just pull one lever without upsetting the entire balance. And so, but just to get to your point about what is the average cost, you know, so average cost right now I think is around $23, $24 a barrel. Transportation is 9 or 10. That's almost half of, you know, the current value. And you take royalty off the top because royalty is part of gross, and so then then what's remaining is then, you know, can be factored in.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Clark?
This isn't my province, but I really like your last point. Ballot measure process is the wrong tool. This is not how you do oil tax policy. The legislature and the government.
Kind of like what we hired them to do by when we elected them, is to keep this sort of thing out of the public social media fiasco that it enters into, and that's very frustrating. A lot of us here have been going back and forth down the GNO to do things historically on both sides of the fence, and I think both sides of the fence have best interests at heart, but in my mind, we're paying those guys who vote, not to go down to GNO, and they listen to the experts. They're right there where they can get their information, and they should be doing we should be doing their jobs for them. And this just infuriates me. So much.
Well, I do think, you know, I've been with it'll be 15 years that I've been with AOGA in April. And in those 15 years, I've spent lots of hours, either in Juneau or at my desk, you know, watching various legislative hearings and testimony, and it is a complicated, complex process. But I would challenge, except maybe naming a bridge. Name one piece of legislation that doesn't get changed in some form or fashion through the legislative process. That's what the democratic process is about. And especially when you get into complex oil tax policy, or like the very complex permitting issue in 2018 for Stand for Alaska. Again, well-intended, potentially, but when you don't have that back and forth and the dialogue and the analysis, unfortunately, it is, again, a take it or leave it approach. So I appreciate your comments to that.
Other questions?
Question on data, confidential data. So currently, does the Department of Revenue receive information from taxpayers that deemed confidential that I don't get?
Yes.
So that would change under this initiative.
Yes.
So other industries, mining industry, refining industry, trucking, whatever, they submit confidential information to the Department of Revenue?
It's my understanding. I mean, I don't represent those industries. I certainly know refining does.
That's my understanding too. So this would be a significant change just in treatment of taxpayers. Take data that's currently given to the government, now it would be given to folks.
Right. And again, every document that we would submit to the Department of Revenue in calculating our tax would become a public document. So because we're a net production tax system, every receipt, every pay stub, every contract that's negotiated, Lyndon's going to find out what, they charge, it'll become public what, Lyndon charged to one company versus Carlisle charged to a company. I mean, it is a lot of data that raises a lot of questions and concerns.
Carl?
Kara, one thing, it was helpful, your discussion, context, as I was listening last week. To clarify, the Willow and the oil search projects, are those on state land?
Willow is on state land, Willow is on federal land, oil search is on state land. So you can see the boundaries right here. This is the boundary of MPRA. And there have been some that have suggested that, MPRA isn't going to bring any value to the state of Alaska because they're going to be able to deduct their costs against current production. Well, that would be true whether Willow was in federal land or state land. And if you read the full memo that the Department of Revenue issued in November of 2018, they said over a 20-year period, once they recoup their costs and start paying tax, which we do pay tax. I don't know how many of you heard me say that we do on the phone last week, and pay royalty in MPRA. Once we start paying, the revenue prediction is that in 20 years the state will have a net gain of $3 billion, and the Department of Natural Resources in February of 2019 testified to the legislature that if you look at the project over 40 years, which they believe that has the potential to be a 40-year prospect, the state, depending on price, of course, but they could have a net gain of $8 to $13 billion over a 40-year period.
Thanks for clarifying that.
Kara, this is Scott. I think you mentioned royalty. Those calculations do not include royalty. That's just severance tax.
Oh, okay. Thank you for the clarification, Scott.
And then also for expanding the jobs, because I had heard that we had in fact had a jobs uptick in the oil industry and that we've seen the bottom, things are turned around. Last week, led to believe, no, that's not true. But now I understand, and I didn't pick up on the fact that it only includes up through 2018 last year.
Right.
I really want to recognize it, reality.
Right.
Thank you.
Yes.
Other questions? Carl?
You didn't mention ANWR, anything?
Sure. So the Tax Act passed almost 2 years ago now that said that we'll have a lease sale or 2 lease sales in a 10-year period. We're expecting that now sometime in 2020. EIA, the Energy Information Administration, since the Tax Act passed, included ANWR in the forecast. And I don't have that slide here, but I have it in other presentations. But if you look at their average, their average forecast, we could see over 1 million barrels from ANWR a day by 2040. And that's the forecast, because they believe it is a massive, we've all believed it's a massive field of 8 to 10 billion barrels of recoverable. That's the average. And if you remember, that was the original projection for Prudhoe, was about an 8 billion barrel field. And we're close to, Scott, correct me if I'm wrong, 13 billion, and we just passed the 18th billion barrel in TAPS last week. So since 1977, we've had 18 billion barrels go through that pipeline and counting, when the original forecast was 8. Yeah, that's a good one. It's a good scenario to be wrong in that case, yeah.
Any other questions before we let these young ladies and Richard go?
Oh, yeah, in the back.
Yeah, I'd just like to make a comment. I think there's a sense here that, everybody feels under siege. I've heard a lot of what you said about the oil industry, and I think we have to look at this oil tax initiative kind of a desperate move, because if the legislature had done what it ought to have done, we wouldn't be in this. Nobody is trying to eliminate oil jobs, but the rest of the state has a lot of jobs eliminated too. And oil revenue is the whole picture. And we're all fighting over that scrap. And I think we have to really take this oil, a very important thing that's happening, and a move by the people to try and get what it says is a fair share, because it's all we've got. So nobody's trying to eliminate anybody's job here, but we're also trying to not eliminate our own jobs. So let's keep an even hand here. I don't know what else to say, but I'm going to vote for the Fair Tax Initiative just because I don't see any option.
And I can appreciate that as an Alaskan. I mean, I have 3 kids. I've got a kid who's about to graduate from high school in 2 years, which is scary to think about. But at the same time, where I want to make sure that they have good opportunities, and we have great roads and a strong university. I'm a huge university supporter. I'm on President Johnson's advisory circle down in Anchorage now. I don't want to see those programs decimated, but trying to go too far on one industry could have long-term consequences for the economy. And so that's what we're trying to convey here is, I'm not here to tell you what the fair share is. I don't know what's fair. All I can tell you is what we currently pay and what the impact would be if this were to pass. And it is a hard policy call for you now as citizens, because it is a take it or leave it. You got to decide, is this what's best for the state of Alaska, or do you decide that there might be other opportunities? And I don't know what those are. That's not my job. But again, I think we have to look at it holistically and present the information to you so that you can make a rational choice about what do you want the long-term future for the state of Alaska to look like.
I can remember going around when I was a kid. My dad was the health inspector, and we'd go around to all the dairy farms back then, all over the place, up in Salcha, Creamer's Dairy, Bushy's up there. I mean, everywhere there was dairy farms before the jets started coming in here. I can distinctly remember the comment that some of the dairy owners would make about, you can only get so much milk out of a cow before you got to cut the machine off, and or you're going to hurt the cow. And that's maybe too simplistic, but that's why I'm so frustrated over this initiative process, because that's how you have to, that's what the people need to know. And I don't think anyway, just think of that poor cow that's getting too many hoses hooked up.
Well, I grew up on a ranch. I had to do that by hand. we didn't have hoses.
Yeah. Okay, Joe, I hope you're not going to ask all the questions you have written down.
No. These are observations more than questions. And part of the Fair Share Act derives from the Republican Governor Hammond proposing that the oil industry should pay 1/3 to the state of Alaska. And I don't hear you denying that that Republican governor advanced that the 1/3 was the fair share to Alaska, and the writings of Governor Hammond that when we were getting 27%, that Alaska was losing hundreds of millions of dollars. I don't hear you denying that we're currently under 20%, and that we are worse off now than the area that the 27% ratio that Governor Hammond was saying was an abuse to Alaska. We're now at 16.5%. That's half of what Governor Hammond said was Alaska's fair share. I don't hear you denying that Alaska's 12.5% is now a unreasonably low current royalty rate. If our oil was in another jurisdiction and current reasonable market value royalties were applied, Alaska would have a double the royalty rate. And so those are the things that I haven't heard you deny.
Well, I am going to comment on those. One, when you talk about the 1/3, I think in your analysis that I've seen in the past is you look at 1/3 state, feds, and producers. But you're missing a component, and that is cost. So I think you have to look at, when you look at most economists' analysis, they never include, or they never not include cost. So you have to take the cost of transportation and the cost of producing a barrel out before, so let me finish, please.
Okay.
And so we have done some analysis. If you look at the value, so the price of times production, and if you take that average out and the total revenue that we pay, and royalty is part of the revenue that we pay, you will see that we have actually averaged anywhere from 24 to 27%, even under the current fiscal year. So we do disagree with how you come up with what you're determining as a third. On the royalty piece, for the 12.5%, we still have a very high royalty when you look at where we are on the competitive boundary. What you're referring to are a couple of private landowners, potentially in Texas, that are taking advantage of the absolute explosion of shale in the Permian Basin. Texas is over 5 million barrels a day of production. They're forecasted to be up to 8 million barrels a day. And so, yes, those private landowners are negotiating a higher royalty today. But again, that is not a fair comparison when you look at the cost to produce that barrel of oil, when you look at the cost of transporting that barrel of oil, and when you look at the fact that they can drill 365 days a year, and their permitting system is less than 30 days. So that's how I would respond, to those two arguments, Senator.
Aren't you, or don't you agree that the royalty in most jurisdictions is either controlled by dictatorship governments or private landowners, and they don't address the cost? It is a royalty on the gross,
Just like ours.
And that commercially,
and it's a cost of doing business just like anywhere else.
Is on the gross.
Yep,
And
just like ours is.
And ours
is on the gross.
Not competitive market value currently.
How is ours any different than, Senator, if ours is on the gross, our royalty is paid on the gross, and it's negotiated.
I agree at 12.5%, 50%.
Kara, this is Scott. Can I interrupt? Kara, this is Scott. Can I add something here?
Sure.
So when we take a look at doing business, we look at every single cost that's out there. And as Kara said, the cost of doing business in Alaska is higher than any place else on a dollar per barrel basis that we invest in the lower 48 or Alaska. Our cost of supply in Alaska is competitive now, and that takes into account the, generally speaking, higher royalty rates that you see in the lower 48, sometimes higher severance costs that we see in the lower 48. But the all-in cost for doing business in the lower 48, despite all those differences, is still lower in many instances than we see in Alaska. If we increase one of our cost components, I don't care if it's royalty, I don't care if it's severance tax or income tax or whatever, Alaska becomes less competitive, and we're going to act like rational investors, and we're going to invest elsewhere. The royalty rates that you see in Alaska are not low compared to other places in the United States. Federal government typically is 12.5% in high-cost areas like offshore Gulf of Mexico. We do see private landowners negotiating higher royalty rates, but those guys at low oil prices become non-competitive and their production gets shut in. That didn't happen in Alaska. We maintain production almost throughout any cycle that's out there. So this argument isn't really, and of course when you get to foreign governments, Joe, those are production sharing contracts for the most part. On low oil prices, the government gets basically nothing. As price goes up, then their share goes up as well. Alaska adopted a different system of taxing its oil than many foreign governments through their production sharing contracts. So bottom line is Alaska needs to stay competitive, and you have to look at the total cost of doing business here. Royalty is part of it, but so is basically the cost of developing the oil.
Sure. Thanks, Scott. Do you agree?
Actually, if I may,
Alaska's 16.5%.
I just wanted to say who he is. Scott whom?
Oh, this is Scott Jepson with ConocoPhillips.
Oh, thank you very much, sir.
Yeah. So, Scott, do you agree that Alaska's share is 16.5%?
In some acreage, Alaska has put out leases for 16.7%. So has the federal government. In other instances, the long-term historical contracts that go back to the 60s are 12.5%.
So the government take in Alaska currently is 16.5%.
Oh, no. When we take a look at what it is for 2018, it's about 20. If you take a look at just the gross, the percentage of the gross, not the net, but percentage of the gross, it's about 23, 24%. If you take a look at...
What year are you using, so I have the ability to verify that?
It's the total government share. That includes royalty, severance tax, all property taxes, and state income tax.
And I understand that, but what is the gross number and what is the take number that you're using for a time period?
So this is for the year 2019, fiscal year 2019. Let me look at this graph. I think that's 2018. All the numbers come from Revenue Sources book. And if you just take a look at the split of divisible income, the state's taking over.
But is it 35 to 40 or?
It's in different sections.
Okay.
You have to look at the average price.
Let me have this.
Okay.
In other words, I don't have, that's
Joe,
not a slide.
Joe.
Sorry.
Okay, could you do that offline, Ms. Scott? Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get Rick before we kind of wrap up here.
Oh, I think I'll forego it. I was gonna make a comment too. I was gonna associate my remarks with Clark Milne, actually, on.
That's always good to associate with Clark. Okay, well,
I have one last wrap up. We'll let Jen wrap it up.
Yeah,
Okay, just
please.
2 seconds. The whole point that we're here is to give this presentation about what's happening with the ballot measure. Please join our coalition, One Alaska. You can sign up here, or if you go to the website, onealaska.com, there's a place to sign up. You can call me at Flowline. I can help you. If you want presentations, let us know. Thank you.
Are you gonna do things to the back of your phone now?
I hope so.
Good, 'cause mine came on.
Yeah. We'll get there.
okay, well,
Thank you.
Kara, Jen,
Yeah.
Richard, thank you. It was great information. We appreciate you coming, and we appreciate you being here. Kara, you're always welcome here, as you know, and anytime you want to move back, we'll help you move back.
Okay, I'll do that. Just when you get Alaska Airlines have their
And just
pilot
for the
base
good of
here.
the order, just to let everyone know, this will actually be the last Energy Task Force meeting for the year. Next Tuesday. Can I have a moment in my boardroom? The next Tuesday is Christmas Eve. The Tuesday after that is New Year's Eve. This will be the last meeting. Happy holidays to everyone. Hanukkah's next week. Christmas is next week. So everyone you and yours have a great Christmas. Happy Hanukkah. All the great holidays. Happy New Year. See you in 2020.
All right.
about you.
Well, you know, you could have been talking about me.
Joe.